Hi there! Welcome to part 2 of my series on color theory, explained and used in Minecraft. If you haven't checked out part 1, where I discuss the basic principles of color theory, please go give it a watch. I'll leave a link for you in the description below. Today, we're going to talk about neutral colors and warm versus cool tones. At the very end, I'll show you some ways that you can use the basic principles of warm versus cool tones in your builds, and also discuss how you can make builds with a primarily neutral color palette. So if you have a hard time figuring out how to use color in your builds, or you get stuck when trying to create a cool color scheme, then this video is for you, so stick around. Alrighty, so let's talk about neutrals. And there's a few definitions of neutral colors, but most of them fall along the lines of a neutral being a hue that is lacking saturation or that is without color, or a hue that is not in competition with other hues in a color palette, which just means that neutrals tend to get along with everybody. I would say that some hues or some neutrals are fairly saturated, but when you get into the whites and the grays, they do tend to turn into tints and shades and aren't as saturated. Neutrals are also referred to as earth tones, which just means that they're more commonly seen in nature. And we do see this in Minecraft, seeing as how there's trees everywhere, stone everywhere, sand. Those sorts of things are most easily obtainable in Minecraft in survival mode, and more commonly seen as you're wandering through the world. So I've split up the neutrals in Minecraft into 5 categories, being white, gray, black, beige, and brown. And all of these categories of neutrals have some of them being a little more cool toned and a little more warm toned. And this can be useful in trying to mesh your neutrals with your color palette, whether you want them to be complementary or whether or not you want a high contrast to the colors that you've chosen. So in whites, we have a few cool toned whites, like iron and diorite. They're kind of grayish and white. And we also have some warm tones, like birch is very warm. There's some pinkish pixels in there. Quartz is incredibly warm and kind of has this pinkish beige in the detailing to give it texture. The closest we have to a pure white in Minecraft, I think, would be a snow, even though would be a snow. Would be snow, even though there's some blue in it. But to me, it's the closest we have. It's not like when you get in here and you actually look at the whites, they're not particularly warm, but they're also not particularly cool. Concrete's really cool in tone. It's kind of got a grayish tint to it. Bone and mushroom are really warm, and you can use these to give a little bit more life to your builds and brighten them up. Quartz is actually one of my favorites. Even though it's kind of a warm tone, it's so bright and vibrant in contrast to other darker colors and hues that it almost looks like it glows. So it's one of my favorites, even though it's not actually a neutral white. Grays are, in Minecraft, are pretty gray. You don't have a whole lot of cool toned grays or warm toned grays. They're all pretty well in the neutral realm. I would say andesite is a little bit cool. Gravel and acacia logs are incredibly warm, actually. Acacia is really warm when you start to look at it, which means that you can use it in a build that's got a lot of grays in it and make it a little more homey and less sterile. But for the most part, grays are grays. The darker grays here, like dark gray wool and then dark gray concrete, are really kind of cool in tone and they're very heavily saturated. And because of that heavy saturation, you can start to see some blues and some greens hidden away in the texture of the wool. My favorite gray, I think, as far as being a neutral gray, is actually cyan stained terracotta because it gives you that high saturation of gray without being as blue or cool toned as the dark gray concrete. And also, one of our newer blocks that came in with 1.13 is coral, which is pretty gray, but it's a really, really warm gray, which means that it gets along really well with gravel, but it looks so pinkish to me. Pinkish purplish. Also, this one here looks like macaroni noodle. Just saying. There's not a whole lot to say about black other than it's black. I will say that obsidian, which I've previously called purple, is very cool toned because all of the highlights are cool toned purple, and I stick by saying it's a purple block, but I think most people probably refer to it as black. Um, Coal is really kind of warm when you look at it. It's got some kind of dark brownish gray highlights, which makes sense because coal is something that's been burnt up into charcoal. Makes a lot of sense to me. The closest we have to a pure black is black stained concrete, and it's one of the coolest blocks ever because you can make like a dark room where you just can't see anything, but it also makes it hard to build with. I will say I wish we had more blacks in Minecraft. Like, I would love to have a black brick sort of thing so you could make some really cool black buildings and you could make like evil castles and stuff like that. I think that would be cool. So let's move on to beiges, and beiges are kind of yellow tinted in general. There are such thing as a cool tone beige, which is also kind of a warm toned gray. I would consider gray stained concrete, or not concrete, I'm sorry, gray stained terracotta to be a cool tone beige or a warm tone gray. But for the most part, beiges are very yellowy and orangey. Um, I would consider oak to be a dark beige, but I do cover it over in browns here in a minute. Um, and beiges are really good for having kind of a soft. I consider beige to be kind of boring, but a lot of people really enjoy beige because it's not in your face or very bold. I like bold. Moving on to browns, and browns I would say are probably next to gray the most common block color that you're going to see in Minecraft because easily obtainable. Like in survival, trees are your best friend. So we have dirt and podzol and coarse dirt. For the most part, really warm browns. Podzol especially is incredibly orange and has warm tone greens in it. Spruce is also pretty warm. I find it interesting that the stripped logs in spruce actually have green in their texture, but it's still a warm toned green, so it doesn't actually change the tone of it any. But this build is made entirely of spruce except for some grass and leaves up at the top. Everything in here is from the same material, and as you can see, oops, I broke it. As you can see, it's still pretty dynamic and still kind of has things for you to look at. Here's an oak one, which I said is kind of a dark beige, but it's also a brown. And again, this is all oak. Everything in here is oak. There's not any different color, but because I used the materials in a way to create unique shapes, it's still a pretty dynamic looking build, especially in the archways here. Dark oak, incredibly warm, very red toned, especially the planks and like the trapdoors and fences and stuff. Really, really warm. The stripped oak or stripped dark oak looks a little bit cooler, but I think it looks cooler here and because it's next to the rest of the dark oak stuff, which is so very warm toned. Carpet and wool, really, really warm. It actually, to me, it looks like an overly saturated orange, sort of. But very, very warm. And a lot of our brown accessories and stuff are really warm toned. The barrel's a little bit cooler, but like the new compost buckets, bins, what are these? Composters are really, really warm. Our crafting bench is really warm. Bookshelves and all that stuff, really warm. Chests don't even look like wood to me, really. They look like orange, sort of. I would love if Minecraft had oak chests and dark oak chests and spruce chests. Like you could have every color of chest and then make it look almost like it's made out of the planks. Like I think that would look really cool. One cool toned brown accessory, at least in comparison to the rest, is jukeboxes or note blocks. That's not to say that it's completely cool toned, but because it has this gray outline and some cool toned browns around the outside to give it definition, it's mostly cool, but it does have a lot of warm in it as well. And then I made a gradient because gradients are fun. And it kind of goes from cool up to warm as well as dark to light. These bottom ones are gray and black stained terracotta. So that's why they're kind of a more cool tone brown as opposed to these up here, which are a lot more warm. So that's a brief overview of neutrals in Minecraft. I tend to build very colorfully. I love playing around with color and seeing what I can create. But I did want to point out that you can make really dynamic and interesting builds using just neutrals. So don't feel like I have to use something bright and bold and super exciting. Your builds can still be really cool and really fun and interesting without going crazy on color. This is actually a really good example of one that's really homey and interesting, and there's something for your eye to look at just about everywhere you look, and it's just spruce. So don't be afraid to play around with a very simple color palette as well as an exciting one. So let's talk about warm versus cool tones. And the best way to explain the basic principle behind warm versus cool tone is actually to use a 6-pointed color wheel. Now my color wheel isn't technically 6-pointed, but a 6-pointed color wheel has your primary colors and then your secondary colors. So red, blue, and yellow, and then orange, green, and purple. And those would be your 6 points. And the idea is that you would divide it in half, and on one side would be your warm tones, and then on the other side would be your cool tones. And the divisionary line would rotate depending on the color theorist. And this brings me up to a good point, which is that color theory is a theory. It's not anything scientific or precise, and it's all fairly relative. So let's go look at some basic warm versus cool tones that most people probably already know, and then we'll delve into the relativity of warm versus cool tone. So here's kind of your basic warm versus cool. Obviously you have your reds, your oranges, and your yellows on one side, and then you have your blues and your teals and your purples on the other. So let's go on to some secondary colors, which can kind of be a little bit difficult to put into a category. For example, purple is usually an even mixture of red and blue. So it's an even mixture of warm and cool. So what that means is that depending on the purple, it can very easily be a warm toned purple, or it can very easily be a cool toned purple. And the same goes for green. So we have a lot of warm toned greens and some cool toned greens. So if you have a green that's a little more towards the yellowy side, it's going to be a warm tone. But if you have a green that's a little more towards the blue side, it's going to be a cool toned green. Here we have some of our neutrals again, and we have some warm toned browns versus some cool toned browns. So these are all kind of warm, beigey, little orange-ish, and these are all pretty cool toned. But something you may have noticed is that in here I have gray stained terracotta. But if we go back this way, I have gray stained terracotta over here. So gray stained terracotta could be a warm toned purple, a warm toned beige, or a cool toned beige, my apologies, or a cool toned brown. So there's a relativity of colors, especially when you have colors next to each other. Certain colors that would look cool on their own, cool toned on their own, might look warm in comparison to other colors. So that's something to think about. And this goes for primary colors as well. Here we have really warm toned, pure red colors. And here we have some cool tone reds that are just, they have a bit of a purple tinge to them. And you can have like a maroon, which is kind of a purple red, or a like a like a burgundy is kind of a cool toned red, or like a brownish purplish red usually. But something else that's kind of fun, like this, I wouldn't consider this a maroon or a burgundy. This is a red. But when you compare it to the reds over here, it's definitely a cooler tone red. And a lot of people refer to those as a blue red. So you can have a blue red sweater, which just means that your red isn't red, it's red. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyways, this can go for oranges as well, which orange is a really warm color, usually. But in comparison to some of the warmer oranges, you can get some cool toned oranges as well. And this goes for blues and pretty much every color that there is can be kind of cool or kind of warm. And if we used all of these in one color palette, it would be an overall cool color palette. But if you were to use these with some oranges or some yellows, they would get along really well because they're warm toned. Unless you wanted to add really high contrast and make the blue pop, you would put a cool tone blue with your oranges and reds. And here's another neutral for us. Here's our cool tone grays and our warm tone grays, which we've talked about most of these already. And then we have our whites, which we've also talked about being cool toned or a little more gray, and then warm toned being a little more beige. So how can we use these in our builds? Well, let's go look at some cool tone builds versus some warm tone builds. Here's one that I made. It's mostly gray with some hints of blue, but overall the feel is very cool and cold. And yes, there's ice, which makes things feel cold, but the grays that I used also kind of make it look kind of cool and chilly. And even if I didn't have the ice, you'd kind of get this coolish feeling to it with all the cool colors. And another one that we use, this has actually got a lot of green in it, but I would consider this a cool tone build. We've got some grays and some cooler purples, and then black being our base neutral. And this is kind of cool because green and purple obviously do a good bit of contrasting, but you can still use them together and make an overall cool color palette. And what happens a lot of times with blues and purples, because they're not as often they're not seen as often in nature, is that it gives you this mystical vibe or like this otherworldly feel. Blues can also give you a very royal vibe, something that feels really rich and unobtainable. These aren't colors that you would see very often, so it gives it kind of this heightened sense of this is somewhere special, this is not of the norm. So those are your cool tones, and you can kind of see if you base a cool tone color palette, the kind of feels and ambiance that you can give your build. Moving on to warm tones. So here we've got some orange and some beige and some yellow and also some very yellowy warm toned greens. And here this is kind of it really does make it feel like it would be hot here. Like this is warm and you want to bring out a fan and lounge and have somebody bring you something to drink. Kind of a very arid, hot, the air is full of spices sort of feel to it. Another warm toned build is this one here. I made a very small but very heavily decorated interior, and we've got a lot of red tones, some purples, and then some red toned neutrals. And it gives it a very homey, warm but not hot feel. And I will say that I did use a few cool tone reds to go with my warmer tones. And so it kind of balances out a little bit, but overall the build is still a very warm toned build. And I've got, I love doing interiors. I don't know if you can tell. I've got my speakers to go with our jukebox and, all kinds of stuff tucked away. And I tried to make most of the stuff actually warm toned. So I've got our warm toned gray corals in here. I used warm toned discs. Everything's kind of got this warm tone to it, which makes everything feel really homey and also a little bit tighter as well. Like if I were to use more neutrals or lighter colors, this would open up. But because I've used these darker colors in here, it does kind of fold in on you and become a little more tight and snug in here, which not always a bad thing. Moving on, I got us an exterior. This I'm really proud of actually, because I generally speaking don't use granite or jungle wood, or if it's pink without being, pink, I generally don't use it, but I decided to go with it for this time. And I actually really liked how this turned out. We've got kind of pinky warm walls, and then you have some warm neutrals to kind of give it contrast but still keep within that warm feel. And the exterior or the lawn has warm browns and warmer landscaping also. So you can make something that would stand out because it would be different. It's kind of all got this feel to it now, as opposed to if it was gray and white. It's it's got more warmth to it, and that makes it feel a little bit more lived in. Like you can imagine people walking down the road, you can imagine activity happening here because there's a warmth to this build. So that is all I have for you today. I hope that you found this video informative. I will be leaving a link to my previous video in the description, as well as some other like color theory informative websites for you to use. And color theory can be used in a lot of aspects. If you're an artsy person and you want to try and create new art but push yourself in a different direction, then come back to color theory, because if you push yourself to use color theory in a way that you normally wouldn't, you can come up with some really cool ideas and concepts. In any case, thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you have any other color-related video ideas, please let me know in the comment section below, and let me know what was your favorite color combination in today's video. If you really like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to see more. I will be coming out with more color theory videos. And hopefully pretty soon I'll have my survival world going. Oops. I was waiting until 1.14.1 so that, I would have the latest version of Minecraft, but without all the bugs. And now that 1.14.1 has come out, I don't really want to play it either. I want to wait until 1.14.2 comes out so all the lighting glitches are fixed, because oh my god, the lighting is so weird. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!